Hi, welcome back to The Basement. I'm Steve Lewis. Today I'd like to go back to the mid-60s heyday of the hit-making Beach Boys to talk about the two albums that they released in the year 1965. Those albums were Beach Boys Today with one exclamation point and Summer Days and Summer Nights with Summer Nights in parentheses with two exclamation points. Both are great albums. Both albums' reputations, however, are largely influenced by one aspect, and that is album sequencing. In one case, it helped tremendously. In the other case, it hurt tremendously, and we'll get into the detail in a little bit. So, the Beach Boys' first album of 1965, Beach Boys Today, is released March 8th, 1965. Now, this was their first studio album in quite some time. Their last proper Beach Boys studio album, All Summer Long, was released in July of 1964. So it had been about 7 months since there'd been a real new Beach Boy album. Now in that intervening time, they had released Beach Boy Concert, they had released the Beach Boy Christmas album, but this was the first proper Beach Boy album in quite some time. And a lot had happened during those months, including a few days before Christmas of 1964, Brian had had his first, what was termed at the time, nervous breakdown. He had retired from the touring Beach Boys to concentrate on studio work, and so Beach Boys Today was going to be the first time that Brian got to show what he could do without the distraction of touring. Of course, things weren't just changing for the Beach Boys. In the spring of 1965, all of popular music was evolving very rapidly. Until just prior to the release of Today, the #1 album in the country had been Beatles 65, which had been released the previous December. It contained such hits as I Feel Fine, I'm a Loser, No Reply. By the end of 65, the Beatles would have out Rubber Soul, with songs like In My Life, Norwegian Wood, Michelle. They'd have out the single Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out. So you can see things were moving at a very quick pace. On the pop charts, there were still a lot of non-rock albums doing well. The #1 album at the time Beach Boy Today was released was the soundtrack for Mary Poppins. Also still high on the chart was the soundtrack for the James Bond film Goldfinger. Also high on the charts was Introducing Herman's Hermits. In 1964, the Dave Clark Five had been the closest English competitors to the Beatles on the American charts. 1965, that would be Herman's Hermits. On the singles charts, you had such things as Stop in the Name of Love by the Supremes, My Girl by the Temptations, King of the Road by Roger Miller, This Diamond Ring by Gary Lewis and the Playboys, Ferry Cross the Mersey by Jerry and the Pacemakers, Downtown by Petula Clark. Within a couple weeks of the release of Beach Boy Today, Bob Dylan would release Bringing It All Back Home. And a few weeks after that, in America, the Rolling Stones album Rolling Stones Now would be released with the hit Heart of Stone. So as you can see, things were changing rapidly in popular music in March of 1965 when the Beach Boys released Beach Boys Today. Now this album has a sterling reputation, but I think if you had purchased this album in March of 1965, you might have been a little bit disappointed. It's a standard 12-track album, as most American rock albums were at the time. However, the final track is not music. It's a kind of a pointless interview. The Beach Boys get lunch handed out to them by Marilyn, Brian's wife, and then they talk a little bit about their tour of Europe. Alan is not present, which is kind of weird. Alan is absent for a lot of stuff at this period. But they talk. It's kind of pointless. The only reason, apart from filling some space, I think they might have included it, is that the Beatles were giving a lot of very funny press conferences at the time, and it might have been an opportunity to see the human side and the humorous side of the band. Of the remaining 11 tracks, 5 of them had already been released as singles. What really helps this album, however, is the sequencing of the songs. So let's look at it, side 1 and side 2. Side 1 begins with Do You Want to Dance, which is a cover of a 1958 Bobby Freeman hit Beach Boys do it very differently. Very nice track. It had already been released as a single in February of 1965 and had been a hit. So you would have already had an opportunity to purchase that song prior to the release of Beach Boys Today. The second track, Good to My Baby, excellent Brian Wilson composition, really showing some growth as a writer. The third track, Don't Hurt My Little Sister, is not what you would expect from the Beach Boys, and there's a reason for that. It was originally written for a Phil Spector group. Whether it was the Ronettes or Darlene Love is not entirely clear. Some people say it was one, some people say it was the other. It's possible they hadn't really decided who it was going to be for. Brian submitted it to Phil Spector. They recorded the backing track. Brian actually sat in, according to Jack Nietzsche, the arranger. Leon Russell was there to play piano but was too drunk to continue. So Brian sat in and played piano. According to some other sources, Phil Spector threw Brian out on piano because he wouldn't do what Phil wanted him to do or wasn't capable of doing exactly what Phil wanted him to do. It's possible Phil Spector was a jerk. Maybe. Anyway, they recorded the backing track. Phil Spector sort of lost interest in recording it, possibly because he didn't have a writing credit on it. And the backing track that he recorded was later used for a song called Things Are Changing by the Blossoms, which was an equal opportunity public service announcement that aired in 1965 with completely different lyrics. So the Beach Boys themselves recorded Don't Hurt My Little Sister as the third track on Beach Boys Today. The fourth track on the album, When I Grew Up to Be a Man, had been released in August of 1964. So it was a much older track, much closer to the time of All Summer Long than to the release of Beach Boys Today. It was the first Beach Boys single written in the wake of the Beatles breaking in America. And though it's a great song and I find it very poignant, I think it must have seemed a little bit juvenile in comparison to the Beatles, talking about, what will I become when these outside forces act on me and I finally become a man, where you had the Beatles who clearly thought of themselves as men and in control of their own destinies and making their own way in the world. So though I love the single, I think it must have looked a little bit sort of juvenile in the wake of what the Beatles were doing at the time. Following that, you get the first version of Help Me Rhonda, which is Rhonda spelled R-O-N-D-A, as opposed to the version of Help Me Rhonda, which is spelled R-H-O-N-D-A, and would be released and become a #1 single the next month in April of 1965. This is a much more stripped down version, obviously not as highly polished as the single. Again, it's a bit unnecessary because the single is certainly superior. Final track on side 1 of the album is Dance, 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 which had been a hit single for the band in October of 1964, the prior fall. Notwithstanding the fact that 3 of the 6 songs that make up side 1 were previously released as singles, it still is a very strong opening to Beach Boys Today. Where Beach Boys Today's real reputation comes from, however, is the sequence of 5 songs that make up the bulk of side 2. Please Let Me Wonder, I'm So Young, Kiss Me Baby, She Knows Me Too Well, and In the Back of My Mind. Apart from I'm So Young, which is a doo-wop song originally recorded by the Students in 1958, and Brian would have been familiar with the Ronettes' Phil Spector version of the song from a few years later. Apart from that, these are all Brian Wilson originals. Please Let Me Wonder was originally credited to Brian and Mike, and since Mike Love's lawsuit in the 1990s, all the songs on this album that are credited to Brian Wilson are also now credited to Mike Love as well. Something that I really hadn't been too conscious of was the fact that 2 of these 5 songs had been previously released. Please Let Me Wonder had come out the month prior as the B-side to Do You Want to Dance, and the one that is really the most sophisticated of them all and the most sort of open and heartfelt of Brian's work is Please Let Me Wonder, which actually had been released as the B-side of When I Grow Up to Be a Man in August of 1964, the prior year. It's interesting that such a sophisticated recording actually harkens back to the middle of 1964. If you've never listened to the second side of Beach Boys Today, I really urge you to give it a listen. It's one of the most enjoyable and beautiful things in the entire Beach Boys canon. It's a big step toward taking the album away from just being a collection of singles with some filler and turning it into an art form on its own. The next Beach Boys album, Summer Days and Summer Nights, was released in July of 1965. And where sequencing had been a big part of the success of Beach Boys today, sequencing to me is a big part of the relative failure of Summer Days and Summer Nights. I had really hoped to talk about that in this episode, but I can see it's going to run way long if I try to do it this time. Please join me next week for an in-depth discussion of Beach Boys' Summer Days and Summer Nights. Thanks very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this. Please like and subscribe. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.